Okay, for those of you that would like to know how to make a jig for putting juice grooves into cutting boards, I thought I'd show you my setup. Doesn't necessarily mean it's the best way to do it, but it works pretty good for me. All I did was I start with some 3/4 inch MDF here. I'm using that just to basically screw these pieces on because they're going to change depending on the size of cutting board you have. The only one that will stay is this one. This back one is always going to stay in the same spot because basically this corner is where I'm always going to work from. No matter what size the cutting board is, I'm always going to work from here. So this one I'll leave attached. Now what these basically are is a 2x4 that I've squared up on the joiner and planer, and then I basically cut a dado into it so that I can run this 3/4 inch plywood as a fence. For me, my router is 2 7/8 of an inch from the edge of the router to the center of the bit, and I like to put my juice grooves, the center of them, 3/4 of an inch in from the edge of the board. So for me, this distance here is 2 1/8 of an inch. Yours may vary. It all depends on what type of router you have. The 2x4 here is after milling them down, they weren't thick enough for the cutting boards that I make. So what I figured I could do to combat that is right now I've got a 1/4 inch sheet of plywood under here, and then if a board changes in height, I can remove this. But theoretically, you want your cutting board lower than this top surface edge because you want your router to ride on this. So you have to be careful that you're not tipping your router in onto the board. You're going to make sure it stays positive flat here, and then you're going to run it around. So basically, with this one staying in place, once I get that there, then I will put this one up to it. This distance is going to depend on this thickness of the cutting board. So as that one gets, once I get that set up, this will be screwed down. Then over here, this one's going to come in, and it's going to go depending on the length of the cutting board. So once that mates up to it, we will screw this one down, and then the final one here, we'll trap it in with this one by screwing it in, and now you've got your box here. So then what you do is basically you're going to start with your router here, lean it in, you're going to run around this fence here, and then you'll be done. And the reason I wanted to set this up is because I have a hard time with burn marks for my juice grooves, and so I needed something that was positive that I could set up and I can run my juice groove quick. But if I do get a burn, I could always just lower the router just a 1/16 of an inch, and then I can run it again, and I know I'm going to run that same exact path traveled. Much easier than trying to clamp a straight edge on it. And then the beauty of this is, so no matter what size my cutting board is, if it's say the same length here but it's narrower, not as deep, all I got to do is move this jig in here, and then vice versa. If the length is shorter, now I can move this in here. So it really doesn't matter what size cutting board I have. I can always adjust to accommodate the size of the board. For me, my boards aren't usually any wider than 24 inches, and or longer, I should say, than 24 inches, and the width doesn't go over 13 inches because that's what I can get into my planer. So for me, that's what this jig is basically set up to max out at. These two long pieces I have cut at 27 inches to allow for a 24 inch board plus 3 inches for the distance here, which naturally isn't necessary. You could always cheat a little bit further. And then these two end ones I have cut at 16 inches. One thing I did find was I made my fence about 1.25 inches tall, and the first time I went to run my router through it, I have this Porter cable here. Well, you can see how the handles are on it. I wasn't paying attention, and it gets set over the fence here. So the handle's hanging over the fence, so as I route here, totally fine, but when I went to come this way, the handle was catching on the fence. So in order, I'm always routing this way, so my handles, that's only going to be an issue on these two end pieces. So what I did to fix that is I've just cut these two fences down to, they only stick up about 1/2 inch. And in all reality, these ones only need to stick up 1/2 inch because the base plate of the router isn't that thick. So that's about it. Once I got it clamped down, you know, I made sure that I sanded these edges a little bit where the seams meet, just to make sure that everything transitions smoothly. I could show you here with this cutting board basically what it's going to do. We will set this board here, square that up to there. Now this one is going to come in right here. Make sure it's pushed up. Okay. Now, like I said, these ones will come in here. And now this final one is going to clamp it in here, and we will just run that up in there. And then now what you can do is you could take a little block plane or your orbital sander and make sure that these screw areas here are flush, because you don't want anything catching on the router. You could see they lifted up after I took them off the last time. So make sure everything runs smooth. You could also be safe, put the router all the way up, or the bit all the way up or off, and just do a dry run with your router. See how it feels. Once you know it feels right, then go for it. I like to use a 5/16 round nose bit. Originally I used to think those were a little too big, but from feedback from other people, I found that they kind of like that juice groove to be a little bit bigger and deeper, because they fill up quite quick. So there you go. I hope that helps you out. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask me. It's really nothing complicated. I used the MDF because I wanted something that when the screws go in, it's not going to strip out as easy, and it'll work fine for repeated use of putting screws in, because naturally they're going to be in different spots constantly. I was afraid plywood might give out and be a little too weak to where the screw holes start stripping out, but we'll see. And if it starts getting too many holes, I mean, a piece of MDF is cheap, so easy to replace, and then you just keep reusing these. So there you go.